All right. So without further ado, and yes, let me bring up Mr. Stephens. He's a retired Texas Parks and Wildlife District leader for the Edwards Plateau, a certified wildlife biologist, 30 years of professional experience. He lives in Boerne. And the book, if you've seen it yet, it's Land Stewardship for Birds, a Guide for Central Texas. So 50 years of research showing that the North American bird populations have declined by about 2.9 billion. So it's pretty serious. And so he's going to tell us a bit about that and human impacts. He's now retired from Texas Parks and Wildlife. So we appreciate you coming out tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. So let me begin by asking a couple questions about y'all. I'd like to know more about my audience. So who's got more than an acre? Who's got more than 10? So does anybody have a wildlife tax valuation? Wildlife tax valuation. So if you have an ag valuation, you can switch it to a wildlife valuation, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The book grew out of a series of workshops that Jan Reed used to work at the Civil Nature Center, and actually I had my office there. And we did these workshops on wildlife tax valuation, and we focused on birds because with smaller acreage, really, you can't manage for deer or turkey. They just need too much space. And the way the law is written as well, it's important to manage for a population, for a group of critters that you're actually influencing. And so birds are a perfect example for that. And so we did these workshops. First, we did them as a day-long workshop, how to write your own wildlife management plan. And then we extended it to 2 days. And then we extended it to 3 days. And then people were going, and we would say, for this information, you need to go to this resource. For that information, you got to go to this resource. And there's a little bit here, and there's a little bit over there. And they said, well, you ought to do it. Jan says that how it started. I don't remember this, but that she said it started by someone saying, well, you ought to do a pamphlet. So a pamphlet, 12 years later, became a 500-plus page book. So one of the things was Texas A&M Press supported us. Actually, we signed a contract. We were supposed to deliver the book like within 2 years, and life got in the way, and they stuck with us. And so we really appreciate that. And actually, if you want to get a copy, but you don't have money to buy it, you can. I've got some cards that have the book title on it and everything, and you can order it from A&M. And there's a code I can give you to give you a 25% discount. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is our book, Land Stewardship for Birds. And one of the things is for y'all, I want you to think that really it's about the importance of native plant communities. And more, two things. One is the book is not a plant book. It's, so it's not a traditional plant ID book. Jan did Trees, Shrubs, and Vines of the Texas Hill Country, which is a really excellent resource. I have some copies back there. But that's a traditional field guide. And this is a land stewardship book. It's not a bird ID book. It's not a plant book. It's how to steward your land to benefit those species, and mainly how to manage those habitats to benefit those species. So it's unique. There's really very few books like this that are out there. So what I want to do tonight is I want you to be able to recognize that we're just going to do a little bit on healthy and unhealthy. We're going to focus a little bit on grassland and live oak savanna. That's most of what the habitat types that we have. If you're lucky enough to have some riparian habitat, that's awesome. But that's more common as grasslands and live oak savannas. And I really want you to inspire you to improve the native plant communities and the bird habitats. So think about them in combination. So land stewardship for birds. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about what stewardship is. I'm going to talk about birds as indicators for success. I'm going to talk some examples of habitats and bird requirements. That's really that core, that information of knowing the bird that you're using as an indicator for the health of the habitat or your plant community and its requirements. So how might your habitat need to be improved based on those requirements? And then also I'm going to talk about land stewardship techniques. And actually what I'm going to do is probably talk about one, but here they are, and so you can think about them. So these are the techniques that we're going to get to at the end of my presentation. It's kind of a audience-led presentation, so it can kind of go in different directions. All these would take me quite a while to go through, but we'll go through one of them. We'll take a survey and see which one wins out. We'll cover that. So I'm going to briefly go through the first part. And so what is land stewardship? Basically, stewardship is the careful and responsible management of anything that's entrusted to one's care. And in this situation, it's land. And in Texas is 97% privately owned. And so what private landowners do really influences or impacts the wildlife that live there. And so they have a tremendous responsibility as well as a great opportunity to be able to manage for that. So it's very different than like Western states where there's tons of public land. There's just not. It's all private land here. So what we want you to do is be better land stewards for birds. Actually, this is Ann and Gary Adams. They're with the Native Plant Society in Georgetown. They used to be in Bernie. So why birds? One thing is birds are charismatic, and they also represent diversity. Just in the different types of birds that you can select or manage for can represent a tremendous amount of diversity in the habitat. When birds flourish, other wildlife do as well, and that they really can benefit easily from habitat improvement. So we know that if you focus on that and improve the habitat, you really can improve the numbers and the diversity of birds that way. And birds need our help, which was alluded to in the introduction. And here's that statistic. This is from a article in Science back in October of 2019. And basically, when we were writing our book, and this is really the second edition of our book, and we retitled it, was that we realized that many of the birds we were selecting or focusing on, and they weren't specifically unique birds, some of them were, and we did that kind of on purpose, but many of them had declined over time. And as we looked at it, one of the things we looked at was breeding bird survey data. And that was a big part of this article was breeding bird survey data. They also used other things like NexRad, radar, estimating migrating bird populations. They can see the bats when, you see them coming out of Bracken Cave. Well, you can also, the weathermen don't show you that, but they can actually see migrating populations of birds. And so they can actually estimate the numbers, and they've gotten really good at it. And that is another big chunk of data that they're using in this paper.
I thought I read that you got about 10% of the birds that were here before North Americans colonized. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. And this data right here is based on like breeding bird survey data. This is a really robust data set that started in the late 60s and is continued on today. They still do breeding bird surveys today. The problem with that is like trying to estimate what were the bird populations. I mean, they talked about bird populations that blacken the sky and and billions of like just one species, passenger pigeons. I actually ran across an account, which is kind of interesting. You don't think of passenger pigeons around here; you think of them as in the Midwest. But there were so many passenger pigeons. There's an account in Bandera County that there were so many passenger pigeons, they were breaking the branches on the live oak trees. There were so many of them roosting in the trees. So it was just, yeah, I mean, so to your point, yes, we're just starting at a probably already diminished bird population in the 1970s, which actually we do know that that's the case, even from just the previous decade before that. So this is really robust data, and it's really, disheartening, to see that huge drop in birds. So abundance has dropped by almost 30%, and it was, as it was mentioned, almost 3 billion birds since the 70s. And the other thing, this is also from that article, and that it's all kinds of birds, groups of birds. So and all the major biomes. So there's only one at the very top that's an exception, and wetlands, and we'll come back to that. But you can see, actually, it's not surprising, just like grasslands, how much native tall grass prairie is left in Texas. Anybody?
1%.
It's like less than 1%. It's just a fraction. A lot of that was all, farm ground. It was easily farmed, blackland prairie, and so it went under the plow. And so it's not surprising at the very bottom to see that grasslands are the most group of birds that have declined the most in that biome. But it also is, forested systems, Arctic systems. And one of the things that they pointed out in this paper that they were really concerned about was forest and habitat generalists. That means birds that are easily adaptable. When we talk about generalists, they usually have a diverse habitat or a diverse food requirement. They also can nest in a variety of locations. They're not just cavity nesters, but they're open cup nesters, and they can nest in a variety of habitats. And to so see that decline in those kinds of birds is really troubling. And I use as an example, well, what's a good example of a generalist? Well, probably the best example that's right in everybody's yard is a cardinal. All right, they're generalists and are very adaptable. But another example is grackles. For me, is grackles. So they don't care whether it's Taco Cabana or McDonald's. They'll get food there. They'll go to HEB and hide under cars from the for protection and drink out of irrigation water. So they're very adaptable. They are not one of the birds that's in decline, but that's just an example. So that's really concerning that all these major groups of birds and all these different types of biomes have declined. The only exception is wetlands. Would someone like to? So there was something that changed in the 60s. Anybody want to? Hunters, actually, Ducks Unlimited. So hunters, duck populations, I, as a kid, was a duck hunter, and I remember all the point system, and ducks, became more and more restrictive about hunting them. And so organizations like Ducks Unlimited were created. And what they did was they went and said, we need to do something about this. The agencies were on board about trying to do something about it. And so there was NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and governmental organizations, state and federal, and landowners and even corporate sponsors came together, and they created what was called the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. In the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, there was a certain amount of money that they provided to it. Actually, I think most of it came from drilling lease money, but they had this money, and it was doing things like stopping people, helping landowners farm around wetlands and that were nesting habitat for birds. But it was things not only in the breeding ground on the Dakotas, but in the mid part of the country, in Playa Lakes country, and the panhandle of Texas and Kansas and Colorado, but also the coastal wetlands. And so there was this big initiative happened, and it helped turn it around. So one of the points here is, this is pretty depressing about all these birds declining, but the wetland birds really show that if we put our mind to it, that we can turn it around. And so so that's possible. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Poster child for beautiful birds, painted bunting. How many people have seen a painted bunting? Almost everybody, if not everybody. And they are very much a Texas bird. This is their breeding habitat or their breeding range. And you can see Texas and Oklahoma is the core of their breeding habitat. So the brighter red is the more dense of the population. So the hill country is, in central Texas is huge, as basically the core of their habitat. And when we look at the population numbers for statewide from Being Bird Survey trends, what the population has done since the 70s is it's decreased by about 30%. And people ask, well, what are the red lines? So any statisticians out there? It's the upper, and anybody took statistics in college? So it's the upper and lower confidence intervals, 95% confidence intervals. So it basically is saying the data is somewhere in that they're confident that it's in between those two red lines, and the center point being the black line. But it doesn't matter which line you pick; it's still a 30% decline. So they have, although there's a kind of a recovery here, but there was also looked like a recovery here, but it still is not a good trend. So one of the things I mentioned was wildlife tax valuation, and it came about in the late 90s, and this is data from the Texas Land Trends. It's actually collected by the Texas A&M Natural Resource Institute, and they publish it online, and it's from appraisal districts. That's where they get this data from. And I looked yesterday, and they still don't have the 2022 data up. And I called them earlier this year, and they said, oh, yeah, we're still working on the data. And so, but probably sometime this year, they'll have that data up there. But I expect that number to be even much higher. So we're talking, that people that are specifically managing, not for livestock, but for wildlife, in Texas is over 5 million acres. So that is a really significant number. And if those people, a lot of them are focusing on birds or wildlife diversity for that. So that's a very optimistic part of it. So that's some of the background. So what are the steps to stewardship? So first thing is identify your habitat types. What are the different habitat types? You may, if you have, even if it's a yard, I only have 2/3 of an acre. Even if it's a yard, it's some habitat type. And so like mine is a live oak savanna. And so, but I do have a little pocket prairie that I manage and have threatened to burn. Actually, do a prescribed burn on it. My wife's like, no, the neighbors already think we're crazy enough. And so, so you identify the different types of habitat you have, and then the quality. So how do you determine quality? And so it's basically going, what really should be there in that habitat type? And so think about that. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that. And that's part of recognizing healthy plant communities. Then what you do is you select a target bird species for each habitat type. Basically pick 2 to 3 species per habitat type. And you don't want to do something like a Carolina wren and a Buick's wren. Basically, they both have the same kind of habitat requirements. They're very similar. So you want to pick 2 different species. So if you pick something like a wren, then pick something more like an overstory bird, maybe even something like a summer tanager or something like that, which is more of a high canopy bird. And then from that, you'll determine the quality of that habitat and the birds that would use that and decide what you need to improve. And then what are the stewardship practices that you need to do, and then implement those. So Jan likes to say that be prepared to be your own best advisor. Look and listen, ask questions, keep learning, find trusted advisors. She always says that I was one of her trusted advisors. And make science-based decisions. So, it's fun to talk to your neighbor about anecdotal things, but keep in mind it's probably anecdote. So base it in science, base it in what is actually needed by the species. Our first 6 chapters are on habitat types. In the 7th chapter, we get into the other things that are problems that relate to birds in Central Texas. One of them is predators and other dangerous animals, deer management. So does anybody not have deer? Cedar and other brush management. Those are all specifically such important habitat or land management issues that we did specific chapters on. Those dangerous animals that are to birds and habitat, here are some of them. Red imported fire ants. We often use RIFA as the acronym for them. Red imported fire ants. Cats, and it doesn't matter if we're talking feral cats or house cats. They are a significant impact on birds. Feral hogs. We have so many feral hogs. AgriLife Extension estimates that there are 3.5 billion feral hogs in Texas. Or million, 3.5 million. That's the same number as the number of white-tailed deer we have in Texas. So that's just pretty staggering. And then brown-headed cowbirds are a special kind of situation. And if y'all want to ask some questions about it, we can get to that. But they're what's called an obligate brood parasite. They never make their own nests. They always parasitize another bird. So they are a problem to those that are highly parasitized, to those that can't avoid parasitism. And example is painted bunnies is one of those. This is a
feral hogs habitat damage, right?
Habitat as well as, they'll eat anything they come across.
So they get nests.
So if they get a nest or even chicks, or they'll eat them.
Wow.
So they're very, and so then, habitat destruction, they're like little bulldozers, but they also love springs. And so water quality issues, there's tons of problems with feral hogs, right? And some of them are specifically a direct predation on wildlife or birds, and others are, indirect, decreasing water quality, damaging habitat. So this is a piece of artwork by Joey Fisher Hine. She's a master naturalist. Any master naturalists? Yeah. Actually, that was one of the things I did when I was in San Antonio, was start the Master Naturalist program and helped it go statewide. So Joey did this painting, talented artist. And you can see, there's the painted bunny, and there's, and blue bonnets and all the feathers. And if you look at the feathers closely, you start recognizing all the different birds. There's actually a cardinal right there. But and so she titled it Silent Spring, 4 billion, one and counting. The estimate of the impact of cats on bird populations in North America is between 2.5 billion and 4 billion. And so she used the upper end, and that's why she's referring to that. Remember that forbs or wildflowers are food for birds and insects, right? I saw you had some things on pollinators, and that's awesome. But also that insects are food for birds. Really important that you understand that actually most birds, there's only a few exceptions, feed their young insects when they're raising their young. So cardinals, we think of as seed eaters. They are made to crack seeds open. And when I was a kid, I caught one and cracked my finger open. But they are really adapted to that, right? To eating seeds. But when they're feeding their young, they want to feed them insects because insects are a very high protein food source. So that's why they do it. So most birds, even those that we think of as not eating insects, feed their young insects. So that's important to keep in mind. So, can you recognize habitats? What kind of habitat we have here? Basically, they're bird habitats, and this is where they find those basic components: food, water, shelter, and space in that habitat. So here are some examples. So here's an example of a grassland. And anybody have lesser goldfinches? Anybody feed lesser goldfinches? And this is also one of those birds that's declined. So we label it as a priority species, and they've actually declined by more than 50%. And they mostly are in Central Texas. And so it really, again, it's like painted bunnies. It really is dependent on what we do as to the fate of this bird. So here are some of the information that we have in our book. Actually, these are on what we call bird summaries. And in these bird summaries, this is just a sample of some of the information. There's more information than this. But basically, you can see that their needs, they're 7 to 15 acres per pair for nesting. So that's their territory that they use. So if you've got 45 acres, you can at least expect 3 pairs, but you could expect more than that. They really need open grassy habitat, but that can be savanna type habitats as well. Insects are a big part of their diet, as well as plant diversity. I mean, we think of them as eating thistle seed, right? And that's what we often feed them at our feeders. But they have a big part of their diet is insects. And they also do use perches for hunting, and actually will then catch insects from those perches. So some of the management practices that are very beneficial, one is doing prescribed burning or mow and bale. And I'll tell you right now, mow and baling is almost just slightly better than doing nothing at all. So burning is really important, and we'll get to that just in a very short second. But also, when you think of your yard, controlling red-reported fire ants and avoiding the use of pesticides, those seem to be kind of contradictory. One of the things to do is to really think about, when you're controlling red-reported fire ants, is to do it as specific as possible. So there are growth regulators, hormone-based baits, and those take longer to act, but the mound dies from a lack of reproduction. They feed it to the queen dies, and the mound will die from a lack of reproduction. And so, but what those hormones do, those growth regulators, they're ant specific. So you're not affecting other types of insects or arthropods. And so that's important. But there's still tons of, I'll give you an example, there's tons of ants that we really want to manage for, want to keep in our landscape. Harvester ants, the big ants that make the highways, the bare spot and make the highways out through the countryside, those are favorite food for horned lizards. And is there anybody that doesn't like horned lizards? If you're from Texas, you gotta love horned lizards, right? And so, but also there's a small ant, and it's called the blue cheese ant. Is one of the common names for it. Its genus is Foralius. It's the one that makes a little. You'll see it in a driveway or a sidewalk. You'll see a little, looks like a little volcano, and it'll be just a mound of dirt that it has brought up, and it'll be kind of cone shaped. And those ants, they don't bite people. But if you take them and you smash them, they smell just like blue cheese. And so that's why they're called blue cheese ants. But one of the other things is they eat, and if you look around that little volcano, that cone, you'll see fire ants, dead fire ants. They will kill fire ants. So we need to be very specific about how we manage our ant populations, because some of those ant populations are helping us control fire ants. So typically, fire ants are really bad in the sense that they outcompete other critters. But Foralius is one of the examples where they actually will kill fire ants. And so you want to be careful about and be very directed about your fire ant control. So this was the same picture I had before, and it's a picture of a good, healthy grassland. This is actually at the Cibolo Nature Center. Some of the things to kind of look at is that you can see that there are different species of grasses there, right? Because just the structure and the color of those grasses, you can tell. There is ever-present King Ranch bluestem, and that's actually what this is back here too. And but if you manage it carefully, you can really keep King Ranch at bay, and give the native grasses a chance to compete effectively with them. And that's just all about proper management. And so it's also, I don't think we're ever going to get rid of King Ranch bluestem. I don't think there's any chance. It's just one of those things we're going to live with as far as an exotic plant. But notice that there are wildflowers in there, so you can see wildflowers in the foreground. But there's actually a lot that are not showing up in this photo. So that's good, diverse, healthy grassland. That is not. This is, even though this is a winter shot, this is almost solid King Ranch bluestem. You don't even see any remnant dried flower heads, right? So there weren't any, forbs or wildflowers that grew in that field. So, I mean, we, as biologists, we would kind of go, this is almost like a biological desert because it's almost a monoculture. So one of the things to do is not just looking out, but look down. So looking at your feet. And one of the things to do, and this is a healthy grassland picture, and the next photo I'm going to show you is only about 100 yards away, and there's only a difference in one management practice between the two of them. But one of the things, let me show you a couple of things. See, this is bare ground. See there? Bare ground. And then you got all these wildflowers that are coming up in here. And so besides the grasses, so it's a good mix of wildflowers, grasses, and bare ground, because what you have to have bare ground for annuals, especially, to reproduce. Just 100 yards away is this unhealthy picture. And notice that there is no bare ground. What happens with grasses is that it builds up all this thatch, dead material, old grass material, and that's detrimental to the grasses as well as to anything that wants to grow in bare ground. And you can see that actually the diversity, the amount of forbs that are in this, it's actually just on the other side of a road. This is on one side of a road, and that's on the other side in a field of a property that I help manage. And the only difference, this was had a prescribed burn. So that's what removed all that litter and made that, gave the opportunity to have bare ground. So look down is part of evaluating the health of your plant community. So here are just some examples of some of the plants in the grassland, and how many species do we probably estimate or think that's in a grassland? Hundreds, right? So this is just, a fraction of the types of plants that would be there. So we really are looking, we may use some of these as key plants, like I'm trying to do this, like little blue stem, or big blue, or little blue stem, or big blue stem. And those can be important indicators of health, and part maybe one of the plants that you use in managing a grassland to decide whether it's healthy or not. So live oak savanna, here's our painted bunting again. One of the things is it's also a priority species, as we can imagine from the data that I showed you earlier. But you will also notice that the habitat needs about 5 acres per nesting pair. So different species have different nesting requirements. And it's interesting, actually, I think I should have looked it up, but it's the vermilion flycatcher that we don't even have. It's amazing what basic biological information we still don't have on birds. Okay. And for the vermilion flycatcher, we don't know their territory size. So basic idea of how many should be is in a particular area, we don't even know that. And so most of them, we at least know some of this basic information. So 5 acres, 5 acres per pair. So you got 20 acres, you could have 4 pair on 20 acres. So that may be your goal for the management of that species. Also notice that the nesting height is 3 to 5 feet off the ground. 3 to 5 feet. Think of a browse line by deer. 3 to 5 feet is what they hammer, right? And so when you don't have that kind of understory, you basically are losing the nesting habitat for this bird. So that's also another one of those things of looking at your habitat and assessing that quality. And and you kind of go, yeah, but we're talking about a savanna. What would that have to do with my backyard? Well, it does have to do with more layering, more shrubs, and so that you should be striving to make it look more like a savanna. Grass areas, native grass areas, but then also layers of plants. So so one of the things is, that's why over controlling deer population is really important. I mentioned cowbird parasitism that is important to this bird as well. This is really good picture. It could be taken back further, but I really wanted the picture of all the trees and shrubs, vines in this motte right here. You can see in kind of the background is a live oak, but there's this mostly is a shin oak, but there's also a red bud there on the left. And you see vines in there. Yes, greenbrier is a good plant. It's kind of like hackberry. People love to hate it. But as I said, one of the things to notice is there is just a variety all through those layers from ground level. There you got an antelope horn, right? You got grasses, forbs, shrubs, low-growing shrubs, vines, small trees, other small trees, tall trees. That's what you should be looking for to evaluate it as a healthy habitat. This is not. And if you look at it, it's basically live oak. There's almost nothing else. There's some prickly pear there. The other thing to notice, fire ants. This not only has a problem in the structure has been damaged, but it has a problem with an invasive species. So that's an invasive insect species. So that's something. So it's pretty clear that that's bad habitat. So and here's just another example. Again, it's just a small, a short list of all the potential species that are important. This one right here, southwestern bristlegrass, is actually an excellent, a favorite seed, grass seed used by painted bunnies. Just as a kind of note. So what about the plants of a backyard? What are the common plants? Well, for me, tongue in cheek, live oaks and St. Augustine. Oh, did I miss it? Oh, I thought I had added that picture. But I had a picture of a yard that had just 2 live oaks and mowed grass. So it can be very diverse and should be very diverse in backyards. And so one of the birds for our backyards is tufted titmice. And you go, wait a minute, does anybody not have a tufted titmouse? Black-crested titmouse? And so, but it's a priority bird. Why? Again, it's actually more limited to the Texas hill country. About 50% of the population is just in the hill country. So what we do to this bird really matters. And that's a big part of it. It's not so much that it's declined significantly. It really hasn't. It's pretty stable. But what we do really does influence this bird, us locally as Central Texans. So that's really important to keep in mind. So seeds of plants and many insects are, they eat lots of insects. You'll see them at suet, right? If you put out suet, you'll see them there. Because they're so associated with backyard feeders, keeping feeders clean is really important. You should clean your feeders at least twice a year, if not more than that. And it's just 1 part bleach to 9 parts water. That's the basic sterilizing solution for a feeder. Keep cats indoors. So one of the things with cats, let me mention kind of quickly that one of the data points that I thought, or research that I thought was really telling about the impact of cats was done in a rural area and somewhere in the Midwest. I think it was Ohio. And the researchers basically were looking at the impact of cats compared to all other mammalian predators, and that cats were eating more wildlife, and only about a third, 20%, third are birds. The rest are lizards and snakes and insects, and that feral cats or cats were eating more birds in these rural areas, or more wildlife in these rural areas, than all other mammalian predators combined. Foxes, coyotes, raccoons, all those combined were not as much as cats. So they have a big impact. Bottom line here is spay and neuter your pet. Keep them inside. If you want to give them an outdoor experience, you can do a catio. If you don't know what it is, Google it. A catio. And so what were the steps to stewardship for birds? Is to identify the habitats that you have, the different types of plant communities. And again, I want you to think about plant communities, the different types and the quality, which we've talked some about. Select some target species, such as some of the ones that we talked about here, like black-crested titmice, or one that I mentioned, Carolina chickadees, and pick 2 to 3 for each habitat type as for your measure of success, but also to help you guide your habitat improvements, and then determine what those practices, those stewardship practices, are going to be. So land stewardship, Basically, I give you an overview of land stewardship, what that was, birds as indicators for success, some examples of habitats and bird requirements. Now we're going to go to one of those. I think we got time for one of them, of those stewardship practices. So, any ideas here?
Brush control. Brush control.
Brush control, okay. How many people say brush control? Seems pretty popular. Let me. I do want to show you one thing real quick in grassland. How many people are familiar, other than Craig, are familiar with Map My Property? Anybody familiar with Map My Property? It's done by Texas Forest Service. It's an online mapping program, and I'm going to show you something real quick on it. And so this is Map My Property, and it's not. You have to look up Texas Forest Service Map My Property, and you'll get it. And it's basically a GIS program. It's powered by Esri, which is the elephant in the room when it comes to GIS, which are geographical information systems. And what you can do is you can put in an address and it'll get you kind of close. That's actually not the exact address that I typed in, but it's close enough. And one of the things that's very cool about this is if you're trying to map out your property, is that this has the parcel data from the appraisal districts. And so here it shows the lots. So instead of having to try to figure out where your property boundaries are, this just makes it way easier. I mean, and so then you can draw out a boundary, say this may be your property in here, something like that. Actually, I'm going to draw out a block that's over here. But these circles, it's something, I don't know what they are. There's something anomalous in it. These squares mean this is for the appraisal district, that this is improvements. So those are barns right there. But it really makes it way easier to find it. So that's really something cool that this program has that not all other programs have. The other thing that's really cool, which you can get it from another one, Web Soil Survey, but you can draw out a piece and then you can tell it to clip it, and you can pick soils and then you can clip it, and it can show you the types of soils that you got there. And you can tell it to give you what's called a full summary. And if you look right here, there's a thing called ecological class. So most of the soils here fall into the loamy bottomland. But I'm not going to look at that one, but that's it right there, ecological class. But actually, what it really is called is ecological site description. And you can, let me see, I'm going to go through quickly. I'm going to pull up. So if I click on one of these ecological site descriptions. Oh, that's your instrument. Oh, I know. I got it. It's a different tab. No, let me try it. So what you can do is when you oops, let me go to the Tesla. Is that you can look at these ecological site descriptions, and it's totally kind of geeking out as an ecologist. But there's super valuable information on this.
Can it do water as well?
There is, yeah, it can draw creeks and streams. It can do watersheds.
Underground?
No, it doesn't have. Yeah, that's a good question, but no, it doesn't have underground water resources. So this one. So if you go to this, oops, I didn't mean to. This is just I just selected something that was kind of typical for this part of the hill country, and I only copied out just a few pages. It's about 20 pages long, 30 pages long. But one of the valuable things is ecological dynamics. Talks about the plants that should be there under, pristine situation. And it talks about the ecological forces, grazing and fire, and how that changed or maintained that system. And so that's really just gold mine of information there. And then if you go down, there's this is totally geeking out, which is that you have the reference site would be the grassland community. And what it does is you can see if it goes to a different ecological state. Maybe this is a better one down here. Go from a grassland to a savanna shrub community. It tells you what was the practices, the absence of disturbance, which basically means natural fire. And then there are things that you can get you back. So it's just the ecologist's flow diagram that's kind of, I think it's cool. This is one of the really valuable things in it. So this is what it has a plant table, and this plant table is the what would be in a pristine or in a historical plant community. One of the things you'll see is in this particular plant community, which is common in this area, that little blue stem would be the dominant plant. And see, it makes up just the vast majority of the total biomass out there. So you should be seeing 50, 60, 70% little blue stem. So that's one of those things to give you an idea of the health of that piece of property. Not only that, but then this is a very cool list to show you. So when people come to me and they go, I've got this field I want to restore, and I want to get a plant mix. Well, this is where I go. So you could pay me to do it. I still work as a consultant. You could pay me to do it, or you can go do it yourself. So you can find this information here yourself, and you can see that it not only has grasses, but it has forbs. And again, it's just it's a good starting place. But the amount of forbs or grasses that you're going to be able to plant in a restoration is pretty limited. A lot of it you're counting on the seed bank that's there. So let me get back to my presentation, and let me go back. Oh. The one thing is you should save when you do this. It is really important to save. So, and then we're going to return. We're going to return. Oh, return. Brush management. So we're going to quickly go through brush management. And really, most of what we're talking about in our area is ash juniper or cedar. And I'll mention a little bit about mesquite. Anybody have mesquite problems?
Oh, probably. Yes.
Yeah, so mesquite can be an issue, right? It's just like ash juniper, native plant, part of the native plant community, but the overall composition, the amount of that, the abundance of that plant has really changed historically. Okay, some of the things about cedar management, old growth cedar is really important on steep slopes. And actually, Steve Nally, I don't know if you know who Steve Nally is, but he is an excellent ecologist, and he says that that may be the most stable plant community on steep slopes. Cedar is often part of a healthy plant community, so we want some of it, right? So it's a really important evergreen plant as far as cover. So it's like the winter coat for birds. If you go out and you have a cedar that has good branches all the way to the ground, you go out on one of those days that's gone from Indian summer 70 degrees to a 20-degree night in the hill country. If you go look in that cedar with a flashlight, you'll see birds roosting in there. So they use it for thermal cover. And so that's really important because we don't have a lot of evergreen plants at that time of year. They're important escape, but also protective cover, which I was just mentioning. Cedar berries are eaten by many species, including these right here. the woodhouse of scrub jay, robins, peregrine robin, and cedar waxwings. And of course, that's what people complain about them spreading cedar around. But one of the most important things is have a plan before you start clearing. And this, don't use a bulldozer. Whatever you do, it's indiscriminate. And as you can see from that photo, it just scrapes the ground, starting from zero. It's like how do you do something so that you have more selective? So select the right tools for the job. If you have small regrowth cedar, a Fisker tool. This is a Fisker made by Fisker. It's a limb saw or a limb trimmer, and it has a swivel head, and you can just walk along. You don't have to bend over with loppers. It's quite neat. But when it gets like this, you can't do that. You're not going to use a Fisker. So what's the right tool? So oftentimes what we suggest is, from a mechanical standpoint, is use a tree shear. And a tree shear can be more selective, leaving some plants and only taking the cedar. And here is actually one of the things that people often think is that you need to replant. It looks bare. It looks like nothing's there, or virtually nothing. A lot of what's right here is cedar sedge, but I'm convinced that actually there are actually little blue stem plants there, but they're so small you can hardly see them. But it could just be a seed bank, and it may be both. But you can see here, it was a demonstration site. Both of these were, and one we did with a tree shear, one part we did with traditional chainsaw. But you can see this is a little blue stem. There's, I think this is Indian grass back here. There is perigrama. And nothing was planted. All that came back just by the fact of giving it light. And so that seed bank or those plants were already there. That's what it looked like before. Basically, all this green is cedar sedge. So there are also cedar eaters, which are, actually they're hydroax is maybe the more technical name for them. And this is what they do. And they're not as indiscriminate as a bulldozer, but if they go up against something, they mulch it. And so it's, you end up having kind of moths like this. And depending on the situation, if you have flat ground that's all cedar, that may be the perfect tool. And this spot, I know, and I thought this was way too thick. And that's usually what I thought, or I used to think with cedar eaters, is they put such a thick layer of mulch down that it would prevent anything from growing. Well, this site, after about 5 years, was beautiful little blue stuff. And it was pretty amazing how much it came back. So I kind of softened my tone. But it's not the tool for every situation.
Because you speak about the seed banks that may be there. These are seeds that have been there for decades.
Yeah.
Yeah. And potentially, 100 years or whatever. So it's pretty interesting if you start really looking closely at where cedar's been cleared and where pastures have been typically overgrazed. You'll get short grasses right up to where they cleared the cedar from underneath the live oaks, which was done in recent years. And then you get this little blue stem that's growing around. And it's basically because the cedar was providing protection for that. And so the other area had been overgrazed, and the competition shifted to short grasses. And so, take a little closer look at the plant communities, and you'll start noticing some of those changes, those differences that are related to the past management practices. This is me, and this is mesquite, and you can see it's tons of mesquite, and we actually controlled this. This was on what's called the Cibolo Preserve. It's a private nonprofit that's next door to the Cibolo Nature Center. It's not associated with the Cibolo Nature Center. stuff got a close name to it, but it's different. It's about 640 acres, and it's got about 300 acres on each side of the Cibolo Creek, and this is one of the bottomland fields, and mesquite had invaded it. So we cleared about 20,000 mesquite using what's called a stump bucket and a tree grubber. We actually used both of these, had different contractors. This is a stump bucket and then a tree grubber, and it basically cuts off the mesquite below the growing point. So you got to get below the bud zone, which is just underground. With a cedar, ash juniper, you cut it off below the lower branch, it's dead. Okay, no problem. You do that to cedar, it just pisses it off, right? And it just comes back, is really angry. But so you can see here, this is the stump bucket and working. And so, yeah, there's soil disturbance, but not that much. And actually, the picture I showed you of healthy grassland looking down, that was a field that we had done a bunch of this. Actually, it was the field that I took that picture of me standing with all that mesquite. But you got to pull it out, and you can't leave any roots still attached to the ground. If there are any roots attached to the ground, that cedar or the mesquite will stay alive. So there's another shot of that. What do you do with all that? It's like it multiplies. If you cut cedar, and it just seems like it multiplies. So what do you do with that? Well, one thing is you can put it on the slope so that it basically helps control erosion from those bare areas after you do it. So you can put it on the slope. You can see that there's some, there's a couple different in the background. There's some more, and it's being laid perpendicular to the slope, right? So parallel, like a contour line. You can also make brush piles out of it. Oftentimes, after you do cedar work, you don't have any low-growing or sort of shrub layer plants. And one of the ways to provide some cover, and mainly it's like grassland birds and other types, quail. It's actually made for quail habitat. Keiki came about with making quail habitat. And you turn the big ends up, and the tops of the trees are down on the ground. And what that does is it leaves kind of an open space in between. And if you lay it down just flat on the ground, just pile it up, it will make good habitat, but lizard and snake habitat. And if you're managing for roadrunners, that's a great idea. Okay, roadrunners love lizards and snakes, and that's what they would eat. But if you're trying to manage, so realizing how you make brush piles can be different as to whether they're better bird habitat or better snake and lizard and rabbit habitat. So, but one of the other things, anybody know Bob Webster? Anybody know Bob Webster? He does a morning gardening show out of San Antonio, and owns Shades of Green Nursery in San Antonio. And so I helped Bob with one of his places, or his property out near Bernie. And one of the things I looked at, he had this it was one of those impenetrable cedar forests. And when he was in graduate school, he did work with black-cap vireos. And I went, Bob, this is like black-cap vireo habitat, but it's overgrown with cedar. And he went, really? And I said, yeah, what you should do is make some big exclosures here, like the size of this room. Then you cut cedar, put it around the edge, keep the deer out. And that shin oak that's still in there, I can see it in there, will grow some lower branches and it's right on the top of a hill. And it could be good vireo habitat. And so he went, great. And so he took it to town and actually ended up making really large exclosures, phenomenal recovery, all kinds of, talk about seed bank and the plants that came back that he didn't plant. He didn't plant anything. He just kept the deer out by creating a fence of cedar, cut cedar around the outside. First, he did ones about the size of his room, and he went, oh, no, I need them bigger. And then he made them bigger. And I think the last one he made was like 7 acres in size. And he said, the one thing you want to be sure and do is keep some cedar nearby that's uncut so you can add to your big exclosure. So you can see this exclosure is huge. We're standing inside. There, another shot. So, and this, there was some amazing forbs that came back in this plant community. And what you're seeing a lot of is Chinook in here, but there's a little blue stem and blue grama, but lots of forbs, incredible forbs that I just wouldn't imagine would have been there. So there's just a couple more pictures. Bob walking. This is a road that he has there, and so he's got cedar exclosures on either side. And it basically just needs to be high enough and wide enough that a deer can't jump it. And you can tell once they start getting in, you can see where they're getting in, and you just go cut a couple cedars and drop them on that spot. And, easy peasy, right? So you can do smaller exclosures, and Jan in her book recommends them and talks about them, and so some of them can be as simple as, and I'm sure anybody here have encaging their plants, their red buds or whatever, but you can use cedar logs and make bigger exclosures like this, and we talk about this being a conservation gardener. So cedar management, these things, old growth is important. That cedar is often part of a healthy plant community. It's important to escape and protect the cover, and it's also important food. Have a plan. So with that, I think that's probably about it. I'm happy to take any questions. I do just want to finish with one thing. I dedicate all my presentations to the memory of my brother, Ben, my baby brother, Ben, who's the one with the fish there. And he passed away several years ago of ALS, a horrible disease. Basically, your mind's perfectly fine, but your body gives out on you. Same thing that Stephen Hawkins has. And Lou Gehrig's disease is another name for it. Horrible disease. And remember the Ice Bucket Challenge? That's ALS. So if you get a chance, donate to ALS. And then also to the memory of my son, who he was killed about 15 years ago. So actually all my, don't write a book to make money, because you don't make money. Royalties are nothing. So I make more money selling books, actually. But the money that I sell that's mine goes to a fund that I've set up in Arkansas, in Northwest Arkansas, where he and I both spent our summers and enjoyed learning, became wildlife biologists. He had was just finishing his degree at Texas A&M when he was killed. And so I've set up this fund, and so all my royalties from this book and from the sales of books go to his fund that support conservation work in a watershed in Northwest Arkansas. So with that, I thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
I just want to make a comment. As a new owner of
Brand new.
photos are amazing. And the people that collaborated with Rufus and Jan on this were like who's who of Land Stewards and Master Naturalists.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was really a community effort. There were a bunch of people that helped us. I mean, all the great photography in the book was done by an amateur photographer, primarily two. One was from Bear Audubon Society, Laura Rindner, and then the other one is a wildlife technician at Mason Mountain Wildlife Management Area, Jeff Foreman. And the best thing Parks and Wildlife ever did was buy that guy a camera. And he takes some phenomenal pictures. I mean, just beautiful photos. And besides people helping us with doing, Ann Adams helped us with our plant lists, and Patsy England and Tom England helped us with reviewing it. I mean, it was a ton of people. So I appreciate it. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. A question about feral cats.
Yeah.
I grew up in a farming area, and every farm had 2 or 3 cats,
Yep.
feral cats. They were not, they had a job to do it.
Barn cats.
Barn cats, exactly. So how do you balance that cat with the job to do?
So I'll give you a little. I'll give you a couple of things. So there's been some research that was done on cats and small mammals, and basically the main small mammals that we have problems with are the house mouse, the roof rat, the Norway rat. Those are all exotic rodents from Europe. They co-evolved with cats and are more efficient at avoiding them. And there's research that shows that cats will catch native rodents more often, and they're not the ones we have troubles with, more than they will the non-native rodents. So one thing is, are they really doing the job we want them to do? Okay. And when I was in Western Kansas, worked in Western Kansas for their wildlife agency, there were people that, yeah, I mean, they would have 20 in a farm, in a windbreak at a farmstead, and they would have 20 cats because there's grain everywhere, and so
Yeah.
that. Yeah, so that it is a tough balance there, but recognize that they are maybe overstated as their value in controlling the rodent population that really is a problem to us.
Put up owl boxes. That's what I tell people.
What?
If you put up owl
Put up an owl box, that's right. Actually, the one in Western Kansas, I had a guy called me and he said, I had like 20 barn cats and now I'm down to 10. Can you come out and take a look? And I went, oh, I bet I know what it is. It's a bobcat. Bobcats love to eat feral cats. They eat house cats. And so by the time I got over there a couple of weeks later, there were only like 2 or 3 cats left. And they were just super skittish. It's like, is there over there? Where the clinics go? And then I found tracks, bobcat tracks. And so it's pretty clear that that's what it was. But yeah, that's a good point, is that there are natural predators to those rodents.
I have 2 questions. One's about cowbirds, and then one's about prescribed burns.
Sure.
I heard from somebody that they killing cowbirds.
Right.
Is it true that you can get permits to kill cowbirds because they are?
Yeah, you actually don't even have to have a permit.
Oh, really?
But what you have to do is you have to. It used to be that Parks and Wildlife had a little permitting training program that they would do and give you a little certification. But it's actually not required. It's actually one of the few birds that's not protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act from the turn of the last century. They, because of their impact on agriculture, eating waste grain and stuff like that. But since then, so Kirtland's warbler is a very rare warbler, almost went extinct. And they figured out that one of the problems was it was being parasitized by brown-headed cowbirds. And the issue with you can trap them, but you have to report that trapping effort to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Okay, so that's the caveat in doing it. And so the reason is because of the other migratory birds. And so people run traps and they catch cowbirds with traps. But you can shoot them all day long, it doesn't matter. The big deal is they used to call them buffalo birds. They used to follow migrating herds of buffalo. And so buffalo could be in a particular area during the nesting season and then leave and then not be back in that same area for several years. Okay, so those birds got parasitized in that area when the buffalo were there, because the brown-headed cowbirds were following the bison herd, because that's what basically provided them food, was the insects they were picking up. And so birds had long periods of not being, and so that they could withstand that parasitism under that natural scenario. You bring European settlers, and my ancestors are from Denmark, and they come over here and they put up fences and they evenly distribute livestock all over the countryside. Now, a bird that used to be migratory during the following migrating bison are no longer doing that. They're basically evenly distributed across the landscape, and and we're pretty sure that there are a number of species that are being. And I mean, a really good example is black-cap vireo, where the controlled brown-headed cowbirds, the number of nesting black-cap vireos is increased by tenfold. So just from that practice. So is it kind of a disgusting? It's the worst thing I do as a biologist is doing cowbird control, but I also feel that I am complicit, at least historically, in making those birds such a problem for our nesting birds. So that's the long thing on it. But you had another question?
Then was prescribed burn. Do you have people that you?
So yeah, if you're interested in a prescribed burn, is contact, the easiest thing is contact Texas Parks and Wildlife, contact your local biologist. Texas Parks and Wildlife several years ago, now it's been 10, 15 years ago, they started having regional prescribed burn bosses. And so they go around and they will help people do prescribed burns. And so they will bring the equipment. There's also prescribed burn associations in some parts of the state. There's one in the Hill Country. There's some in Southeast Texas. And so that's another way. Basically, landowners helping other landowners. But the easiest thing to do is contact your local biologist, Parks and Wildlife biologist, and they can come out and talk to you about doing a prescribed burn. So, and it should scare you. It should scare the tar out of you. You shouldn't, if you're complacent about it, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. But it is but it's also a super powerful ecological tool. I mean, it's really incredible kind of responses you can get.
I have a question. Way early in your talk, in your presentation, you talked about the difference in a wildlife exemption versus an ag exemption.
Right.
Does your book address that?
It does. It's in the introduction. I encourage everybody, even though it's a resource book and you kind of go, oh, here are the chapters I'm going to focus on, read the introduction. There's a lot of great information. The stuff about Map My Properties in there, but other resources as well online. That's what we've updated in this version too, is a lot of different things like that. Yeah, we talk about wildlife tax valuation and also give you reference where you can get more information, which basically costs.
Is it to do that?
So you got to have an ag valuation first, and you got to have at least a 5-year history before you can switch it to wildlife. And that's the sort of basic premise of it. It depends on the county you're in as to how many acres you need, but typically it's 20 in the Hill Country. But it depends on the appraisal district. They may or may not allow you to do it with less. You can do it with less when you do things like co-op. If you get another person, go along with them, you can qualify with fewer acres. So that's also an option. But you got to have an ag first. A lot of people go, oh, I don't have an ag. And what they've been doing is using fees to get their ag valuation.
Once you have an ag valuation, if you let it go,
then they basically, so an ag valuation, you're taxed at the value, the potential agricultural value, production value of that piece of property, which means it's a fraction of the market rate. So if you're going to
get it back.
You can get it back.
Only through the fees.
You go through, you have to, or if your neighbor has cattle, then you just work with them and you can have cattle come in for a short period of time and then take them out. Think of it as a pasture in a rotation system. And so you can have them come in and graze and then go back. The main thing that I would say there, don't graze it at the same time every year. So 1 year graze it in spring, next year graze it in the fall, next year graze it in the summer, because otherwise it just shifts the plant community. If you graze it at the same time every year, it shifts the plant community to particular plants that aren't grazed at that time of year. So that's probably the long version. One more question, maybe?
Yes, I have two quick questions. One is, what do you expect the life by one of them cedar firms to be? Do they last 5 years or 10 years, and before they turn to dirt, or what do you think?
Yeah. So the question. Go ahead.
I'll put out. I didn't see on your list of grasses, cut grass. I understand that's a very important grass to painted bunting, and I was wondering about.
Oh, that's a good one. I probably should know that, whether cut grass is going for, and it does kind of ring a bell, but I can't remember. But yeah, it was just because it's a short list. And if you look at, some of that, you'll see that cut grass can be on some of those other, like in the soil survey information, the ecological site assessment, liable to be there. Yeah, and that's a neat grass. But again, it's a short list. It's not all the grasses, and so that was just a sample. The other question was about the cedar corrals and how long the berms of cedar last. And when they're laid down, they don't last as long as like when you do a teepee, right? And so when you lay them down to do those great big corrals, they don't last as long, but they will last longer than you might think. The one thing that I think is kind of a challenge is doing a prescribed burn around or having a fire come through them, because then they'll just, they'll destroy them. Maybe at that point you kind of go, oh, I've done what I needed to do as far as the restoration, and I'm in a lot better place. But Bob's, as far as I can tell, Bob's has lasted about, it's been probably at least 10 years now. I was just out there like last year, and it still looked really good. So, and was still functioning. And he's added some, but not a lot, of the very first ones he did, which were almost 10 years ago. So they can last that long. Yep. So I want to thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. I do have books for sale at the back if you're interested in a book. You can also go to A&M Press, and if you use the code stewardship, then you get a 25% discount. So for those people out there, but we encourage people to support A&M rather than Amazon, because Amazon didn't support us and A&M did. Thank you very much. Thank you.